2017 has been a really very tricky year for journalism, with fake news and all the other issues that are going on. And in 2018, we at the Bureau are pretty sure that things are probably going to be even more difficult. And we use that to justify our existence, because we think that it's extremely important for there to be well-established investigative units, really in order to keep evidence-based reporting going, which we see as essential for a free democratic society. That may sound a little bit grandiose, but I think, knowing who the audience are this evening, you'll probably all agree with that. We choose stories that matter. We partner with major news organizations, so you'll see that we very seldom publish on our own. And Rachel's done a fantastic job, actually. We've been in partnership with all the leading media in this country and a wide range of international publishing partners as well. And we do that because, really, if we were based only on our website as the platform to reach our readership or our audience, we would get nowhere. So we see that as a mutually beneficial arrangement with our partners, because they get good fact-based work from a credible source, and we get increased reach. We try and select subjects that we think are underreported but are also extremely relevant, and our strategy is based on focusing on a reasonably small number of key themes. At the moment we're intensely covering 2. We're just about to expand seriously to 3, and we hope to broaden our range to about 5. As well as aiming for range of work and reach, we've become very exercised about the subject of impact, which is what, as a non-profit organization dependent on philanthropic funding, we have to be able to justify that there is some result of our work other than simply stories that are published. And this has led us some very interesting internal debates about the difference between being a campaign organization and a purely journalistic organization, which we may actually get into later this evening. But our view is that a campaigning or a campaign group starts with a clear aim, and then selects its work to justify that aim, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do, which is to gather the facts, tell the truth. But we still want to be a campaigning organization once we have the facts, because we feel that it is important that what we do results in change. And those of you who are following our website may have noticed the recent work on large-scale factory farming, which was a spin-off from the work on the antibiotic-resistant drugs. The resistance to antibiotics, and that had quite a considerable effect on the policy at DEFRA over a very short period of time. And that's exactly what we want to achieve. We want to see something happen as a result of our work. Now, I now come to the one main point that I want to make. The board has just agreed to a very, very aggressive, rather ambitious growth strategy. We're going to try and grow our output. We're going to try to grow the range of work we do. We're going to try and grow the number of partnerships we have. We're going to try and increase our reach, and we're going to try and increase our impact. And this is going to require a lot more funding, which will make me probably even older by the next time you see me. So tonight we're launching a small thing, but which is part of that new fundraising mission. And on your chairs you will see that there's a leaflet for something called the Friends of the Bureau, which I hope that some of you will feel well enough off to consider responding to this offer, because it's an attempt to bring a smallish group of people in who are donors to be quite close affiliates or close partners with people at the Bureau. You'll see by reading the leaflet that the offer is that there are various ways in which you can interact with the Bureau itself. So I think actually, without further ado, I will hand it over to the panel. Thank you very much indeed.
I spend a lot of my time sort of consulting with journalism organisations, non-profits, foundations interested in funding journalism and activism. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating is the shift in the last couple of years, particularly in the UK and in Europe, towards thinking about lots and lots of different kinds of people, activists, investors, foundations, and so on, interested in journalism in a way that they weren't 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I'm not going to mention the names of those who are responsible for this, because I think you all know who they are and they get enough coverage, as we already know. But I think the other thing that happens in a lot of the work that I do is dealing with some of the big picture challenges, big picture issues that are facing the media that are maybe on the sort of negative side, the things that relate to press freedom. You know, Article 19 reported the other week that press freedom is according to its index, the lowest that it's been since the year 2000. You know, there is a bleak, in some respects, outlook in some parts of the world around the media, but actually at the same time, many people are talking about what is a golden age for journalism. Many people are talking about unlimited possibilities for journalism. And what we wanted to talk about tonight really was that side. You know, we often hear about the bleaker side, the activation around campaigns, the pressing governments to release journalists, as is happening in Uganda and so on. But we wanted really to talk about what can journalism do and unlock, and what are the different forces driving that, what are the different ways in which journalism, particularly investigative journalism, is doing that currently. And we've got three extraordinary exponents of the art here tonight. The other thing is that I want to be very, very conscious of is that the audience is, I mean, all of you are at least as, if not 10 times more able to chair and even be on the panel than I am or any of us. So I think it's you know, we're conscious that in the room there's a huge amount of expertise. We will hear from the panelists initially for about 5 minutes each, then we'll have a little bit of questioning from me and discussion, and then we'll open up to you, because I think there's a huge well of expertise and interest from lots of different angles in the room, and we do want to encourage that and get a discussion happening fairly quickly. So I wanted to start really at the far end with Peter. One of the huge shifts that's happened and that's been enabled by the various changes that are happening in technology and so on is collaboration. You know, the media show today on Radio 4, Amal Rajan was talking about sort of collaboration and how it's a big shift. You know, journalism hasn't been disposed, journalism organisations aren't necessarily disposed to collaborate very freely. So that is a huge shift. And I wondered if you could talk about that, both in the context of some of the broader shifts that are happening around, you know, Panama Papers and those sorts of cross-border investigations, and also in the thing that you're running now, that you're the launch editor of Wiki Tribune, which I think at its very heart is about collaboration and decentralisation of power.
Yeah, thanks very much, Samir, and thank you for having me here. I was going to be here anyway, but I thought I'd be out there rather than up here. Can I just also say I really admire what Rachel's doing with the Bureau, the Investigative Bureau. It has grown extraordinarily, and I think it's in incredibly safe hands, and I admire what that organisation's doing. And I want to address 2 points about that at the end of my 2 or 3 minutes, probably not 5 minutes. Until recently, until February, I was the CEO of the Centre for Public Integrity, which incorporated the ICIJ, which has done the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, Swiss Leaks, and so on. The key to that collaboration is very different from the kind of work that I'm doing at Wiki Tribune. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, if I may, very briefly. The key to those projects was trust. It was the initial point of trust, particularly in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, that the leaker trusted the Obermeyer twins, who aren't in fact twins or brothers, but the Obermeyers from Süddeutsche Zeitung. They bonded, they got the trust. As far as I know, they still don't know who actually leaked the Panama Papers. But that was also built, the respect for that organisation and for the ICAJ had already been built by Swiss leaks and offshore leaks previously. And so the organisation had scaled up a reputation for trust, a reputation for keeping its mouth shut, and a reputation for distributed decision making, in a sense, on some of these stories. And what was extraordinary about the Panama Papers for me, I wasn't there when we did they've subsequently done the Paradise Papers, but there's nearly 1,000 journalists working on that story for a year before it broke. And I remember having a slight coronary when I picked up The Economist one evening on Thursday evening, and there was reference to Mossack Fonseca, the company involved, in a story about Petrobras. And it was deeply implicated in the Petrobras scandal in Brazil. But the Brazilian reporters who were part of the Panama Papers syndicate did not publish it at that moment. They could, if I was them, I almost certainly would have. They stayed. They sat on the rest of the Panama Papers throughout the evolving Petrobras scandal. I think that was part of the trust and part of the understanding. It's also one of the reasons that you asked me yesterday about this, Samir. It's one of the reasons why, in many cases, the ICIJ network has been driven by one-to-one relationships with reporters. Gerard Ryle, the director of the ICIJ, has really expanded it into media organisations, but some media organisations are not willing to engage in true collaboration. And that's particularly the larger ones. They will not submit to the scrutiny that goes along with this, to the agreements on timing of release and so on. So I think it's to The Guardian and various other publications immense credit that they've had. I think there were 8 people at The Guardian working on the Panama Papers. It's to their immense credit they effectively outsourced news editing of that story to another organisation in a way that implies immense trust and confidence. And I think that's much harder to achieve with some of the bigger media organisations. So yes, we are taking collaboration to a slightly extraordinary extent with Wiki Tribune. Wiki Tribune has been founded by Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia. Jimmy is an optimist who believes that the good in the crowd drive out the bad. I'm not quite as optimistic as he is about that, but so far so good. The principle that Jimmy's working on this is that the community will be of equal stature to the journalists. The tricky part of that is that most people in the community can't in fact write journalism. So we have guides on how to write stories. In some cases they have written remarkable pieces. There's a French diplomat who, a retired French diplomat who's written probably 6 or 7 analyses pieces now about whether Britain, future of Europe, Brexit, the kind of thing you can imagine somebody who's slightly prolix doing. But they're actually, each time he does them, they get better and better and better and easier to edit. So I do have some hope that there is quite a lot of expertise. Well, we know that there's expertise. I mean, this is the contention behind this project is very similar to that in a book called We the Media by Dan Gilmore, who's an American professor, one of those professors of the internet who occasionally lets us use it. And Dan's contention was the audience was always smarter than you were. There was always more expertise in the audience than you had on tap as a journalist. And of course that is the case. The experts are out here, they're not up here. But it's tapping into them. So the project is really to tap into expertise and to tap into talent. And that talent might be punctuation. The Oxford comma is going to be an extensive question of debate on Wiki Tribune. And as its launch editor, we will be doing the Oxford comma, based on the judgment of the Washington State Court, which cost billions of dollars based on the Oxford comma. Look it up, it's a good story. The biggest fear that my staff have, I have about a dozen staff everywhere between New Zealand, Southeast Asia, the United States, and mostly here, is the fear of the audience, in a sense, the fear of losing control of their work to the audience. And so we work again, we're working with that. It is a genuine fear. I mean, I had somebody very early on, when we were still behind beta, change my apostrophes from it is to just it's, and it drove me absolutely mad. And so there's a huge amount of pedantry there as well, but there's also really good calls which say, how can you back up that assertion? So neutrality, what Jimmy calls a neutral point of view, which is very strongly part of the Wikipedia tradition, is coming in. What I try and argue on that front is that we cannot have neutrality with a lack of interest or being uninterested, not disinterested, but we will not be uninterested in what we're writing. We will not be saying sexual harassment, good or bad, you tell us. or slavery, good or bad, you tell us. And that is quite different in some respects from Wikipedia. We have 5,000 people as of tonight. We've been up a month, 5,000 people registered on the site. They have essentially the same power as the journalists to edit, create content, talk about we don't call it comment, they talk about it, they have a discussion about it, they make suggestions. Everything at the moment, and this is one of the issues that I want to address, does go through an editor. Everything to be published does go through an editor. That is because of British libel and defamation law, and because we're based here, and so we're not covered by Section 230 of the US Communications Act. We cannot consider ourselves to be a platform. That has been a very interesting learning curve for the Americans involved, particularly one of them. So that is an issue about quality, and that is an issue about law. So the 2 points that I would like to put into here is the best thing that could come out of this event is further pressure for something equivalent to the First Amendment in the United Kingdom, is dramatic reform of the British libel laws, and a true commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which we do not have. Forget Leveson, let's go for freedom of expression instead of restraint on the press. And the other thing is the tax deductibility of news. It would make a tremendous difference, I know, to the Bureau and to many other organisations, and I think it's time to do that. Thank you.
I think perfect segue to Rachel and the Bureau. I mean, we've talked a fair bit about the Bureau and the kinds of things that you've been able to sort of focus on and achieve. What building on what Peter's talked about, those trends, your use of data, use of collaboration and so on, and particularly in the context of, what you've been doing recently in collaborations with local journalism around the UK, which we, as we all know, is sort of in, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Just to put things in context momentarily, I just wanted to say that for me, the reason why I'm feeling quite optimistic, I think 2016 was a year in which the media became the enemy of the people, and it wasn't just a bit of mudslinging. There really was some truth in that. We had failed as an industry in the run-up to the referendum. We had failed as an industry in the run-up to Trump. However, there's lots of reasons this happened. Obviously, the fact that the media industry was hit by the juggernaut of programmatic advertising, which meant, of course, everyone was focused on survival rather than their mission, which was to serve the public. What I think has happened in 2017 is we've started to see the return of the mission. We've started to put value back into the industry again, or to speak to the title of tonight's event, we've started to remember that there is no truer cause in journalism than to speak the truth and shame the devil. And we have seen some really great reporting this year. I mean, if you look at the reporting on the BBC or in the papers around Grenfell, I think that's, there's been some really exemplary reporting there. The reporting that's gone on in Myanmar around the plight of the Rohingyas, that's come up into focus because of journalism. You may say that the horse has bolted, but nonetheless we have got a much better reporting about what's going on in Washington and around Trump and around Brexit. And we've also started to see that journalism can really have impact. And I'll talk about one example in South Africa and the fall of Bell Pottinger, because this is a story that is really close to my heart and a story that the Bureau has been looking at for many, many years. In fact, last year we published a story about a rather controversial, very large contract that Bell Pottinger had with the Pentagon, worth at least $500 million to produce propaganda, fake news, rather problematic false flag tapes that the Marines would distribute around Iraq when they did their raids, in the hope that people would pick them up and watch them, and this would ping out a message so that alleged terrorists could be identified and targeted. So, and when we rang up Bell Pottinger to say, so what do you have to say about this? They said, oh, we're a completely different organisation with a new management team and we don't do anything like that anymore. And 8 months later, the final nail in the coffin, the chief executive resigns after the revelations in South Africa, and the company is no more. So, that's journalism having impact. We've also seen, as Peter has just been saying, some really innovative, experimental, models that are really making journalism work again. I mean, Paradise Papers and Panama Papers are the prime example. It's a model that we have borrowed in our Bureau local project, which is trying to encourage more investigative, public accountability journalism at a local level, where journalism has literally fallen off a cliff. And this project has, in just 8 months, done 8 investigations in collaboration with over 450 people in the network who've worked together across 100 cities to produce more than 150 stories. So yes, we're seeing new models, we're seeing new launches, we're seeing highly paid big names of the media leave the BBC and set up new ventures. So as we go into 2018, I am feeling a bit more optimistic about this industry than I ever was.
Can I just hold it like this? I made the joke that I'm not good at Janet Jackson, but Rhythm Nation was a fabulous album. First of all, I do want to say that I am going to sign up to be a friend, even though I feel like I was a friend before. I'm going to start paying, but I am going to sign up because this is essential for, there's a lot of bitching and moaning about what's happened with journalism, but not many people write checks for it. So I've given a weekly talk for the last 10 years to fundraise and rally and gin up people around the question of saving journalism. And when I always ask the question, are you subscribed to your local paper, maybe 10%. And the average age of the 10% that raises their hand is probably 75 years old. So first of all, I think tonight is about calling bullshit on some of this, frankly. So raise your hand if you think the world's going in the right direction. Okay, so raise your hand if you spent more than $20 on lattes or Americanos or macchiatos in the last 7 days. If we think that this is going to happen on its own, if we think that somehow magically the internet's going to save it, if we think that things can't get any worse, you're living a lie. This is a disaster. So the very foundation of civil society, right, which the rule of law is about, right, and in the US the First Amendment is about, and the notion of facts is primary for, all of that is at stake right now. And it's not at stake somewhere else. It's at stake in the UK, it's at stake in the United States. And I think finally, they're calling our bluff. Because in the US, the organization I recently ran, 40 years old, it's the oldest nonprofit investigative organization. But even if you're the New York Times, right, even if you have a 100-year tradition, we've always claimed that we're essential to democracy. But now the bill is due. And the question is, are we? And if we're so important, why is it going this way? How did we get Trump as president? That's a fair question. We blew it, right? Like, we were not covering all of the issues. And at the same time, we are not prepared to deal with state actors who have taken over the internet. The internet is in deep doo-doo right now. The internet was supposed to save, right, so many different things on the planet. There's not one internet out there either. If you live in some countries, you don't have the same internet that we think we enjoy in some other countries. So there's a lot of complicating factors right now. And I would ask the question, if we're going to fight back, if we're going to resist this temptation to despair, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it by working together, so that's the collaboration angle. And we're going to do it by investing in organizations that have some fight and some will inside of them, that have some spirit. So why am I in London with you all, besides the fact that it's a great town, love it. I know in the US there's probably 150-ish viable nonprofit investigative-ish organizations that range from 2 people to 80-ish. And I have to say that I would put the Bureau really at the top of that list. And not just in terms of the quality of the reporting, but in terms of the spirit and the backbone of the organization. Because again, from where we're standing today, I think the next 2 years, this fire will continue to burn, and it's going to burn down more things that we thought would never disappear, right? So I'm developing a series on NATO, the idea of the European project. I thought, like, hey, you can thank me later for Trump. What are you guys doing over here? What the hell's going on? And the average American, the average educated American, cannot explain what the hell's happening with Brexit. So I feel strongly that in the US we have a head start in terms of philanthropy, right? We have a 100-year tax code tradition where wealthy families get to protect some of their family wealth by creating foundations which, God bless them, fund investigative journalism and journalism writ large in the US. Our public broadcasting system has depended on that philanthropy since day one, so we have a different set of dynamics. But there's more money here for this kind of work. And I would argue strongly that we need to create scaffolding that helps that funding come to organizations like the Bureau. And most importantly, London's going to be okay, right? Ish. But as I've asked the question of what's happening outside of London, and I'm not familiar with it personally, but as I've asked the question and tried to interview people about it, this crisis here is as bad as it is in the United States in terms of the polarization and the disconnect. And the fact that the Bureau has carved a wormhole through its local initiative that has some of the beginnings of what a solution actually looks like, I feel like it's just probably the most important investment that can be made in the UK. And I feel like as an American citizen, for Christ's sake, if you're not doing this work, like the American-British alliance, which again, I'm from the Bay Area, so it's like, this is not like, if we expect to protect civil society, there's something to be said about what the US and the UK have done together over the last century-ish. So how do we protect that going forward, frankly? And however much money might come into journalism here, it's not enough. Well, that's one problem. The second thing is, this is all going to be people doing real work. So the amount of time and energy it takes to do that work really falls on the backs of the journalists and Rachel and the board. And I would just encourage everybody to spend time with these guys, because you will get ignited about it. You will get activated, and that's a positive way to fight back what is otherwise a very despairing time.
May I add something to what Joaquin said? I know this is slightly changing your agenda, but there are two words that Joaquin used in there that we don't use enough in the UK and that we ignore at Alpera, and that's civil society. We take it completely for granted here. And I can tell you, having lived in countries like Romania and post-communist era where the civil society had been destroyed, and where I was recently editing a newspaper in Cambodia where the next English language newspaper was shut down by the government in a very Putinesque tax dispute, and where the Prime Minister quotes Trump about press being the enemies of the people. We're in a moment where you've got newspapers calling people traitors, where you're getting the judiciary being called enemies of the people. There is a civil society fight to be had here as well. I don't think anybody is actually in the media to blame, as it were, for Donald Trump. The US electorate made its decision, however badly informed, and we can discuss that a little bit. But I do think that there is an urgency about the commitment to civil society and journalism's place in civil society, which you are highly unlikely to get from the Daily Mail and General Trust.
If I can not intervene, but editorialise there a little bit. One of the projects that I work on is with the right to information community across Europe. So I'm talking to a lot of different donor organisations, Open Society, Secret Browsing, all of these kinds of traditional, human rights focused foundations. Over the last year or two, one of the things that they have been talking about increasingly, there was a thing by Thomas Carruthers 3-4 years ago, which is about closing space in civil society. And the thing that's sort of come up in their rearview mirror is the impact on journalism. And now I think you're absolutely right, that civil society funders are now looking at journalism as the canary in the coal mine, as much as they're looking at sort of attacks on human rights defenders or other particular signals. They're looking really at how they too have a stake in journalism, because they can't, even in Europe, and funders from who have been funding internationally for decades are now looking at Europe and the UK, France, even Germany, to shore up and protect that fabric of civil society and the protections that the media enjoys, the protections that citizens enjoy. So it is, I think there is, in a way, the sort of, yes, that's true, but actually there is now, I think, a response is coming, and there's a good opportunity for those involved in journalism to think about how to present the case to those kinds of funders, other kinds of people investing in journalism to sort of strengthen. That's my sidebar. So why don't we talk a little bit about the funding then? I mean, you know, what is? I mean, you've talked very forthrightly about the difference between, you know, the sort of burning platform that we're all standing on here in Europe and the sort of response in a way in the US. What could we be doing more? What are the things that are actions that could be taken outside of just purely giving money? What's a sort of slightly more strategic view of what could be happening from your perspective?
Yeah, and this goes back to the campaigning principle, right? I mean, there's work to be done in terms of building local caucuses, which could be meetups, they could be design groups, they could be events, they can be creative exchanges where journalism is centered, and having that happen all over the country. It's not free to do. The Bureau is doing some of that work right now, but by inviting other stakeholders to the party, I think there's a way to really build more community around what the forces are that are acting, and connecting to the content, right? Because it's not just saving civil society, which I do feel strongly is at stake. This is fabulous content. This is important storytelling, and it's just as good as anything else that you can spend your time on. The Bureau did this series, which I've read up on, No Refuge, about domestic violence shelters and the rollback of resources and just how difficult it is for these women to get into a safe place. And this is fabulous. It's fabulous storytelling. It's really important stuff. So I feel like there's a cultural force here in bringing people together around it, giving them access to the journalist so you can meet and talk to a journalist, and then asking those community members to help think about what solutions are to the problems that are being reported on.
Yeah, I think just to add, I think that's a really important point, that another opportunity and something that we are really starting to see that's new is that journalists are getting out of their ivory towers and starting to think about not just collaborating with other journalists, but that we have to also collaborate with the communities that we're supposed to be writing about and telling their stories. So that, I mean, this is one thing that we're trying to do in our Bureau Local project. 400 people in the network are not just journalists, they're interested citizens who know there's something going on here, know that there is a problem in the real world, and actually passionately want to do something about it. So, you know, they're offering up skills like, I'm an illustrator, do you want me to illustrate? Or, I've got 2 hours spare, what can I do? Or, I'm a civic tech person, can I help build your database? This sort of engagement outside of our niche world that we've existed in for far too long is a massive opportunity. It's new, it's quite scary as journalists. We like talking to people in terms of we like questioning them, we don't really like talking to them, so it's going to be a little bit tricky and a little bit difficult, but there's definitely opportunity out there to try and explain what's going on and try and change things by seeing ourselves as part of civil society and not just an outsider.
What you're talking about, the sort of face-to-face dimension, partly the sort of, you know, there's been a sort of shift of organisations. It started with Pop-Up Magazine on the West Coast of the US, and it sort of spread to Europe. There's one in there are these live event-based journalism organisations that are trying to build, you know, sometimes extremely curated, extremely theatrical, sort of, you know, a magazine in an evening as a theatrical experience. There's one in Denmark run by Zetland. It's called Live Magazine in France. There are things like this happening all over the place. You've got Chequeado in Argentina and the Ferret in Scotland doing live fact-checking events where they're sort of involving and working with citizens across their country, sometimes across the region. In Chequeado's case, they do these in lots of countries in Latin America. They're leading that movement of sort of engagement and participation in journalism and sort of unpacking a little bit what journalism means and what it looks like to do it. So I'm sort of curious about where you think that dimension and can go, what potential there is here, you know, in this country or, you know, in Europe more widely or whatever, and and also what that might do in the trust relationship that you're sort of talking about, those bonds that then, you know, people are then there for you alongside sort of membership schemes that we can talk a bit about later. You know, when you've got those pressures on you from the civil, you know, on the civil society's facing, people who will back for you. You know, whereas journalism maybe was not quite in that domain. It was really a specialist pursuit to sort of advocate for journalists a couple of years ago. It's not quite so cut and dry.
Yeah, we created a theater project, actually speaking of theatrical, that we called Storyworks, and in its 6th year. So we take an investigation and commission a one-act play based on that investigation. So the play is fact-based, but it's a work of art. So the reporters and editors would work with the playwright and the director and the actors to produce and then stage in front of a live audience a one-act show. And the first time we tried it was because the woman Jenna, who's still a creative director, she had gotten a hold of her own sort of feminist theater space in San Francisco. And she was like, I can give you $25, but I also have this theater. What do you want to do with it? And we didn't know what would happen. And the first night sold out. It sold out for like 6 straight weeks. And the experience of the audience was transformative. And they didn't leave the very first performance. Nobody left. And so like we started coming out like, what are you doing here? And they're like, well, we have questions. And so now a part of the model is to actually have a second act, which is the reporters, sources, the playwright, come back on stage, and then the audience engages very directly with them. That project has gone all over the US. It's been in Mississippi, North Dakota, Kansas City, New Jersey. And again, small bore. This is like small batch. These are 100-seat houses, so it's not like 10,000 people there. But the power of that relationship is really something special. And it allows another constituency, which are people who like to go to the theater, many of whom like journalism also, to have this other way of actually participating. And every time you do that with community members, something good results from it, even if it's not great art. And it won't always be great when you try to do creative stuff, but every time you activate those relationships, it builds equity.
I think I make muesli quite regularly, granola, and it's got so many nuts in it now. It's basically a snack rather than a breakfast cereal. But you cannot force people to eat granola, much as you might want to. You've got to make this stuff entertaining. I think we've really got to also make sure people will say, God, I want to read more worthy 5,000-word pieces about gender, and they don't, unless it's about Harvey Weinstein. People will tell you that they want to read, serious stuff about Brexit, and they don't, in fact. So we have to address people. We have the opportunity now, remarkably low cost, to address people where they are, when they want to be addressed, when they're prepared to be addressed, and we have to build media brands and products that touch people where they are. I incredibly admire what Joaquin has done, and when I proposed it to my team in DC, they said, I'm not doing slam poetry, I didn't get into investigative. And that would have been an absolutely perfect thing to have done a slam poetry thing on. But we have to go where the audience is. I think the best example I can give you right now is a small media company in the States called Skift, which has been founded by a friend of mine, Rafa Ali. It is probably the cleverest small media company in the world. It now has the #1 travel conference in the world. It has data reports, it does events, and it has a really successful website. It's not in our area, but tracking that kind of model of the combination of events, tweets, whatever it is, the biggest thing is, do not blame Facebook and Google for where we stand.
Blame them
Only a little bit, yeah.
With what?
25%.
Did you get money from Google, Rachel? Because we did.
Absolutely, and you can still blame.
Yeah, but let's just it was not our advertising revenue to take away. It was the advertisers' revenue, and they've gone, and they're never coming back, unless you're Tyler Brûlé and you end up selling it to them anyway. But there is a place for high quality advertising in these products that we're building. But blaming Google and Facebook for the state of where we're at is a zero-sum game that is not worth playing at the moment, which does not mean that they don't have very important responsibilities, which it is wonderful to see Google having now faced up to, and I think Facebook is in that process of facing up to some of its responsibilities, which I'm happy to deal with in questions later if you want.
I think we can come back to Facebook and Google. I don't think they're going away. So I mean, that trust relationship, the mission, that you were talking about, Rachel, is something that I think is particularly interesting. I think I did a piece of research last year which interviewed a bunch of organisations, the Times, a bunch of UK media of reasonable longevity, Dutch media, similar length of time that they've been running, and almost without exception, every single one had gone back. When I asked them, how are you dealing with the questions of today, they all mentioned their founding date. It was really peculiar. Every single one was talking about the date they were founded and the founding documents, and going back into those documents and trying to find how the original founding articles of the Times or the Corona Amsterdammer or whichever thing it was relevant for today. So I'm curious if can you talk a little bit more about that sort of the relationship, the mission to where we are now?
Well, I think if you put it into the context of what we've just been talking about, sort of finding new ways to tell our stories, I think if we're refinding the value of news and our mission, it's also really important that we understand who we're talking to. And one of the problems I think that the media world has at the moment is that we're talking bubbles. So we talk to the people who breathe and speak and think the same. And we've really got to try and work out how we get out of our ivory towers and how we get out of our bubbles and really start to connect again. The local paper used to be read by everyone. It used to get it every single day or every single week whenever it came out, because it was the thing that you bought your car from, you bought your house from, you found out when the local fete was, and you also got the news about what was going on in power and how money was being spent. But it was the thing that connected you to the world in which you live. And it didn't matter what class you were from, it didn't matter which side of the fence of the political scale you were from. It was talking to everybody, and that's what we've got to try and do as a media. We've got to try and start talking more to just more readers. Who do these stories matter to, and how can we get there, and how can we speak to them?
On the trust question, Sumi, I think it's a really interesting project that's come out of the Markula Centre for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University called the Trust Project, which everything that I've built at Wicked Tribune is compliant with the Trust Project. I hope we'll get our little T symbol shortly. The Economist has joined it, I think the FT, Washington Post, various others. And what it is and I tried to do this a few years ago here with the Media Standards Trust, who some of you will know, Martin Moore, and it is a set of basic principles based on surveys that show how people gain trust in media organisations. And I think there's one very, very simple one. The Washington Post now has at the bottom of every story, Joe Blow has written 13 books about Donald Trump and was an experience, has covered the White House for 12 years. It's a little reference to the authority of that person. And there are all sorts of little signals like that media organisations can give to reinforce that. It's also noticeable Reuters now attaches the original Reuters trust principles, which have defended its neutrality since the Second World War, to every story now. And that's how they, they're making a statement about their ability to be on both sides of any story. And I think some of these little signals, some of these symbols are very, very important over time.
I think trust in the audience is the perfect point at which to ask the questions.
I'm a journalist, or was a journalist. I'm an advisory board member of the Bureau, do various other things. I run my own not-for-profit journalism outfit. None of you, I noticed, have talked about distribution and impact and all those things that funders want to know about. And in fact, journalists want to know about. You've talked a bit about stories that change particular situations. A lot of the stuff that I have heard about in conversations before this panel started, I didn't know about, and I thought I kind of was tracking this stuff. So I think that we do have a problem about, creating a culture which shouts louder, that gets above the noise, that gets above the legacy media, which still kind of fill our headspace. So I'd like to hear more about that from you guys. Thank you.
So I have a little bit of a geological perspective on distribution. In the nonprofit world, stage one of development is just, can you get any money to do this work? Okay, so that's hard. It's really hard to get any money to do investigative reporting. So that's like stage one. And there's a lot of two-person nonprofits, oftentimes, especially in the States, laid off reporters from the local paper, go nonprofit, and somebody gives them $30,000 and they make a go of it. Stage two, which I think the Bureau does an extraordinary job at, is do the best investigative reporting and then work through channels of partners to reach audience. And that's a phenomenal way to work. ProPublica is the best in the US at doing that. When I was running the center, we continued to do that, but decided we needed our own platform. So we launched a weekly public radio show and podcast called Reveal, which took us 3 years, but ultimately got to 450 stations and has about 2 million weekly listeners. So that was able to kind of provide a platform. And that third stage of providing platforms, I feel, is really, really a rich opportunity in the UK. If I were running Planet Earth, I would take the drone coverage of the Bureau and make that a Netflix show. And season one, every season is a case, is a story, and you go deep in the way that they do. You bring the characters out, you go to location, and you basically have Homeland divided by something, right? Times X, multiplied by Spotlight. There's rich narrative in here, so I feel like this is an opportunity for the Bureau, and it needs to start to happen because audiences will relate. They'll say, oh, I watched that. In the US, Orange is the New Black did more, frankly, to spur prison reform conversations than all of the reporting that had happened for the previous 20 years. It captured people's imaginations.
Rachel, do you want to mention, I think there was a session at the South Africa Journalism Conference about something not dissimilar to that.
Yeah, I think, so a couple of weeks ago I was in Joburg at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. There was 1,200 investigative journalists there from all over the world. It's just, this thing happens every 2 years and it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You come away feeling very humbled and very inspired by what everybody's doing in different parts of the world. But one of the big things that everyone was talking about was impact and how, as a community of investigative journalists, many working in not-for-profit organisations, how we can come together and really work out what we mean by impact and where on the line of change do we sit. The line of change starting at paper of record, which is not interested in change at all, it's just about recording the news, to the NGO, the super campaigner who doesn't really care about the facts, just wants to see change. So, you know, there's lots, virtually everyone was talking about how we measure it, what we mean by it, how important it is, how we've got to start shouting about it, because for sure journalism does have some levels of impact. It is a vector within the process of change. So, you know, and that is that collaborative thing. We've all got to start talking, communicating, sharing, and working out a way through this. You've done quite a lot on impact, I know. I
have done a lot on impact, good and bad. One of the nice things about Wiki Tribune is it's not taking any advertising at the moment. Jimmy will say Wikipedia is the 5th largest site in the world. That's how you get impact, is by having something that is compelling and grows. But it has taken 16 years to get there. I don't think we've got that much time. So, but we will not be measuring page views in the same way we would if we were running an advertising business. We're running engagement, and what I hope to get out of that is a kind of Wiki Tribune number, which will be a formula where we can say that's a category 12 story, or that hit 6 on the Bale Richter scale in terms of a combination of impact, sharing, that kind of thing. And I think we will need those kind of formulas, and people like the Omidjar Network and OSF are all very keen of them. It would just be quite good if they all agreed on one.
Hi, Heather Brook. So I'm an investigative journalist and currently running the investigative course at City University. I wanted to ask about this conflation of expertise and elitism. And I guess it's particularly directed to Wiki Tribune, but there is this idea that everybody can be a journalist, this whole kind of citizen journalist thing. I mean, as a long-time professional, I think there is actually it's a craft, it's a vocation, and it's something it's an expertise, and so it does kind of annoy me when anybody can just pick it up in a day. Because you can't, and actually, I spend a whole year teaching people to be journalists and professionals about it, and I think there are actual benchmarks of the craft, particularly around verification, what is truth, how do you prove it, criteria, etc. And aren't we just sort of peddling this, isn't Wiki Tribune perhaps just peddling this continued mythology that there isn't really anything special to journalism, that anybody can do it doesn't require any special skills? Because to me, that is part of the collapse and the crisis, is that there actually was an expertise and a profession, and it was this kind of institutional memory that actually had the skills to hold power to account. And if it's just a bunch of amateurs, is that not part of the reason that things have collapsed?
So you're blaming the collapse on Wikitribune after only a month?
No, I blame it on this idea
No, I
that
understand.
anybody can be a journalist, and that there's nothing, it's not a valuable skill.
Absolutely. So can I say to you, I've really admired your work and I've wanted to meet you an incredibly long time, so it's worth having come tonight to do that. You have done one of the greatest stories that's ever been done here, and then got kind of scooped on it a little bit, I think, unfairly, and I have the greatest respect for what you do, and if the city's lovely, lucky to have you, but I'm not just blowing smoke at you because I'm about to destroy journalism and hand it over to the public. I would like you to come in and have that conversation with Jimmy at some point, because I think that is a really important issue. I have joined the project to deliver the most professional core journalism that I can for that project, not necessarily to teach the world to sing. And so I am focused on the content that the staff produce, and then making the best I can of the content that the audience, the community, then produces as well. But the community can create content. At the moment, it is going all through an editor. Some of it is quite hard to get to that point. We have a remarkable guide to how to write a story for Wikitribune that was written by a former Bloomberg person, New York Times person, who's a member of that community. If my staff read that to themselves once a week, their content would already be much better. So it can be done. There is talent out there. There's talented journalists out there who want to contribute to it. I think where the key comes, though, is in this area of crowdsourced fact-checking to some extent. Error correction, maybe something as small as punctuation. But I think you're absolutely right that there is a risk in some of the language that we might use, that might be used, which suggests that journalism is not, in fact, a quite important and acquired skill. And I can tell you, I've been around about 100 years, and it's been really exhausting to try and turn an interesting group of young people into reasonably mature journalists in an extremely short time, let alone trying to do the same with the community. But the community does have deep knowledge and deep experience about many multifarious issues, and Wikipedia is the answer to that. But it's also worth remembering Wikipedia is not a source, as it were. It's a source of sources, and it's a source of validated sources of material. So it's that validation, and I suspect what the true community content will become is a validation. It was noticeable, though, that when Jimmy talks about this a lot, the Wikipedia work on the Grenfell Tower fire was extremely fast, very comprehensive, and perhaps an interesting example of what might happen in local journalism through citizen journalism. But you're absolutely right, and I am not there to diminish either my own profession, but I'm also not there just to defend my own profession no matter what. I'm learning a tremendous amount about the surrender of control that is required.
But it's a really good point. If there's not paying jobs for professional journalists, what world are we living in? If you think about the impact of the internet in terms of creating a lot of empty calorie information, where you can spend all day and not actually read any verified reporting on the internet easily. There was a time before 1948 where there was literally no fast food in the United States. Now we have rampant diabetes driven by incredibly poor eating habits. Totally self-driven disaster, but there are systems issues, and I feel like when you drain out the idea that this is a profession, as much as I've been involved with community sourcing and community engagement, there's a real cliff there. I don't know if we've got one foot off or we're falling off of it or what have you, but if there's not jobs for journalists, we're totally screwed.
Can I also just to be clear, we published, I think on yesterday, our first major investigative piece of work, which I commissioned from what you might call an unemployed or retired journalist in New Zealand, about the murder and modern slavery aboard tuna ships in the South Pacific to bring us our sashimi. So I am committed to paying for good content as well, and to investing in it. So, and I encourage you all please to look at that story and give me feedback on it. So I am committed to that, but I'm not the founder, I'm the launch editor.
I do have there's another question over there. There's one there, and then I'll come over here. Just one thing that I think is interesting when you're talking about the sort of diabetes dimension of information. There's a very some of you may have come across a report that was written, released about a month ago. It's called Information Disorder, and it's released by the Council of Europe. And it was written by Claire Wardle and Hossein Darakhshan. I'd really, really recommend you look at it. It is an exceptional piece of work at diagnosing and trying to unpick some of these issues. I think the thing that comes out of it, most interestingly for me, is the renewed role of journalism. And that's happening at a policy level where people are being pushed to think about it, pushed to re-recognise, and I think many news organisations are stepping back up into that role and finding their sort of role in that disorder environment, you know. So I think that is something that you'll see happen more and more and more. It's being covered absolutely enormously, actually. So I definitely recommend everyone take a look at least the op-eds about it, if not the whole report.
I'm from Varsity, the student paper at the University of Cambridge, which makes me obviously a very young journalist, but also basically a local journalist only. So apologies if I lack of experience in some of the things that lots
Never
of people
apologize, dude.
will know about. Okay. I wanted to sort of ask you all more specifically about audience building and how you reach people who aren't interested in news. I mean, one of the, for me and I, we've already discussed how you can bring people to facts, but they won't necessarily engage with them. For me, one of the most affecting pieces about Brexit was actually one that came out about a year late. It was the one by the FT journalist Paul McLean, who was sadly killed earlier this year, about the number of trade agreements that would have to be negotiated after Brexit. I thought it was a brilliant piece of journalism, and it just in figures and images showed information that everybody needed to know, and it came out too late. Even if it had come out in time, people like my grandfather, for instance, who voted for Brexit, would never have seen that piece. It would never have reached him. Would have stuck to maybe reading the Daily Express that day and not seen anything. How practically can we reach people who are like that? I mean, I know the internet is connecting people to more and more diverse sorts of journalism in some senses, but how do you actually go out and get those facts to people, and how do you make the journalism that engages people? Because we've all agreed it has to be engaging, but how?
Rather than despair, I think we need to think about the opportunities here, and it's up to you actually. It's not up to us. I'm an old generation. Our model is no longer working. We need to find new ways of working, and this is going back to my point about we need to work out how on earth we get out of our bubbles and how we actually properly get information, facts, stories out to the people that matter and out to people who are not used to reading this stuff. And maybe it's through theatre, maybe it's through plastering facts and information that we find on coffee trucks going around the town. Maybe it's through using Instagram, maybe it's images, maybe it's short videos. We need to see it as an opportunity. We need to think that journalism is not just about the words on a written piece of newspaper that is going to be used as chip paper, which that is still how we see news and dissemination of news. We still see that bit of paper as journalists as the important thing, and actually it's not how people get their news anymore. And there's so many opportunities, and we need to get smarter.
How old is your grandfather?
His mid-80s.
Mid-80s. Where does he live?
He lives in Maidenhead.
Can't do that in the UK.
Very close to Theresa May, Maidenhead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you guys are doing this with the Bureau Local Initiative. The whole principle of design thinking is to ask those people, ask your grandfather and his homies, how you might reach them next time in on an issue like this, or how they're now thinking about Brexit and how they're getting information in on that. Like, they'll tell you. They'll tell you how they would like to get it. Maybe they need some creative ideas, but there is this initiative that the Bureau is doing, which is activated all over the country, that gives you a little bit of a skeleton key to then bring those voices back up to a newsroom that can then go and cover in a way that those folks will actually receive it.
But one of the interesting things in the US is that funders have prioritized understanding what communities want. So the Knight Foundation had its Information Commission, and initiatives like that have deliberately gone out to try and find those cold spots, news deserts.
Yeah, there's way more money. There's not enough money in the UK for news organizations to do this, so there does need to be a concerted campaign to get funders to turn this on, frankly, because it's not free. right? And we do have a lot of learnings about what works and what doesn't work. And frankly, like, I've never seen an initiative, even in the US, that says, we gotta get 85-year-olds to pay attention for the next 5 years. Because they have money, they go to the doctor, they're gonna vote, like, they need more information now than ever before. You could run a whole campaign on 85 to 90, don't screw it up for the rest of us, guys.
That's right.
You said something about climate change, sort of kick something into gear. So I have many hats. One of them is a kind of media one. So just to disclose, I advise a media group. I'm emeritus editor. We have 400 people on our payroll. So we get about 100 million page views a month. It's in English language. So where is that? It's in Bangladesh. Now, climate change will, investigative journalism means that arsenic poisoning is something of more concern in Bangladesh than climate change, which is very unfortunate. So my whole thing, listening to you folks, is it's not about the future of journalism. It's about how to animate and enliven knowledge and to share that and to create interaction around that. Now, I have another hat as an artist, and I was an artist at Manifesta Biennale in 2010. And I collaborated with an artist who was animating the news of the day. It created tremendous impact. This is in Murcia and Cartagena. Extraordinary impact using hacking into a lot of means. I'm also an innovation professor, so I'm really interested in the innovation of many professions. And we talked much earlier about partnership and collaboration and the hybridization of stuff. So for me, sitting here, I'm thinking, my God, I live in London, I advise on different things here, but also I have this connection out in Bangladesh. And this is really exciting, but what does it amount to? What for me, I'm trying to do a takeaway because I have 400 people there in Bangladesh who need inspiration, and we have bombs thrown at us and our staff get beaten up. When we're covering the Rohingya, it can be okay, it cannot be okay. I think Rachel knows that I was trying to influence our coverage of it. In fact, I managed to change the way in Bangladesh the media were covering the Rohingya because of the way we use that portal. But take inspiration for our journalists, because the business model is really tough back there. And I was telling somebody here that clickbait is actually unfortunately a big way to fund a lot of our stuff. And you talk about training journalists. I get very disappointed by the quality of writing on our site sometimes, but people are reading it and it's put up very quickly. I advised Larry Sanger when he did Infobit, so I have some views on maybe Wiki Tribune won't work. But what I do know is people do go to stuff which is put up very quickly. But I'm very interested in the whole idea of collaboration, because I think to make this sort of knowledge lively and out there, it's not just, you have to look beyond the idea of media people, and we're all liberals here. Do you know what I mean? It's,
Speak for yourself, Alice.
Yes.
Do you have a question?
Question is, are you folks thinking of collaborating well outside of what you're already doing? Because that's what I'm looking for.
Yes.
So I have a view that the David Simon television show The Wire, I think it's the finest piece of journalism that's been done in the last 20 years. It is journalism by other means, and I think that's one of the things that we have to see, that we have to see as journalists. I mean, Joaquin's poetry things have been absolutely fantastic. The work that group did. I mean, they were so imaginative about different ways to deliver journalism that I'm ashamed by comparison on the things that we did at the centre. It is going to have to be these things, and actually, there was a wonderful thing I saw at the, I don't want to give the impression I go to journalism conferences all the time, but it was at the Logan investigative journalism thing in Berkeley a couple of years ago, which was a wonderfully produced comic by some guys in Detroit who were doing comic news. But the great thing is it was still fact-checked, it was still accurate, there was no misrepresentation, and that's the key. It still has to be, the drama cannot be over-dramatized. But if you think also, look at Ralph Fiennes' Coriolanus, set in Serbia. That is a terrific piece of journalism, and I believe Shakespeare's, got some good gigs going there as well. Not to get into the homie versus gig versus old people thing.
Question at the back.
So, my name's Richard. I unfortunately work in television. I'm probably going to piss you all off. So interesting. I like the idea that you think that fiction as journalism is good journalism, which is an interesting idea because it's fiction. So David Simon's The Wire, whatever you call it, it's fiction. It's made up. It's not fucking real. This is an important distinction to hold between journalism and the orange is the new black, whatever it is. I'm a little drunk too, so this is probably not going to go well.
Go for it.
But you know, what the hell, right? So I remember a few years ago there was this like greatest music documentary in the world competition, and Spinal Tap won. And I was a bit like, yeah, the thing is, Spinal Tap's actually not a fucking documentary. It's made up. Now, there's a serious point behind this, actually. Right, as a TV journalist, sometimes, unfortunately, or whatever, I do TV journalism. We are fairly well regulated by Ofsted. We have to tell the truth, not something the print area has to worry too much about. I'm a bit concerned here that the idea that I think you said, why did you end up with Trump as president? I'll tell you why. Because of the fucking Apprentice. Because of reality TV is presented as reality. The issue that I worry about here is that we are conflating fiction and non-fiction and creating a world that doesn't exist, that people then believe is real, right? And so the whole shouting of fake news, I'm not sure fake news is fake news, it's just news by other means. Right, so the problem here we have is how do we distinguish or get people to distinguish between reality and fantasy? Because at the moment, people don't do that.
But let me, first of all, you didn't do a good job of pissing anybody off, I think. I think you're right.
You can do better.
But Trump didn't win because of The Apprentice. His show got canceled.
He won because reality TV made him into a character that people believed in.
I'll give you 5 points for that. I'm not giving you 100.
Okay.
What happened was Nixon's Southern strategy created a racialized environment for middle class to working class white folks, and Trump, like his other Republican presidents, did exploited that. No, but this is important. This is important. So, yes, what is the cultural context for the dialogue? Of course, reality television has had an enormous impact on how we view things, and the cable industry has fed right into that, along with college football, absolutely. But is it the reason why? Absolutely not. There are the economic conditions on the ground; those are real.
Well, that's simple, obviously.
Of course, it's not. But I take your point. I will just say, don't ignore the power of culture to drive how the actual political discussion happens. And TV good.
Like a month ago, I was at the Ethical Consumer Conference where there was someone from Good News Network, right? And it reminded me, when my friends talk about news, they say they turn it off, they stop watching because everything is so negative. And you know, it's really like having a psychological toll on people. So I want to ask you, like, how can we make news that empowers people, that is more like solution-oriented, even though, you know, there's a lot of negative stuff happening out there?
Well, I think that sort of talks back to the previous question. It's like, you know, how can we get people to distinguish from fact, what is fact to what is fiction? Because actually what they want to watch is fiction, and what they want to read is column 3 of the Daily Mail online. You know, how can we make the world a less depressing place? I don't know. We put celebrities on the front cover of our newspapers, and we have reality TV on our TV stations, and we have Strictly on prime time on Saturday. That's how we make people feel good. But interspersed with that, we've got to report on the news, and we've got to report on what's happening. I think your point about solution journalism, this is a big debate that's going on in the journalism circles at the moment. Is, you know, we need to empower people by offering solutions, and we've got to remain independent. And who are we to say what the solutions are? Because you're just journalists. But nonetheless, we can offer solutions up by talking to people who have solutions, and you can build those into your stories.
I also think the BBC does a really good job with the thing at the end of often on the radio will say, have you been affected by this? Come on to the BBC. You know, they're very, very good at either the taking action or the have you been affected by it. And I think that's a remarkable piece of work.
Also, just radical optimism is okay. You know, it's like, who else is going to do this work? You know, why the hell are they the Bureau of Investigative Journalism? Like, what do they think they're going to accomplish? This is absurd. that you would even spend a day trying to make the world a better place by reporting out facts. Like that in and of itself is a beautiful act of ridiculous optimism, and it should be celebrated and repeated often, right? And I'll use an old version of what you said. I'm on the board at Consumer Reports. It's actually the largest nonprofit journalism organization in the United States, right? It's about 250 million. It is still the number 3 or 4 magazine in the United States. It has testing labs. It does policy work, it does advocacy work, and it has a firewalled newsroom that is quite large that takes on this one nonpartisan issue of keeping people safe, right? And helping them make informed choices. So what's the Consumer Reports for immigration? What's the Consumer Reports for Brexit? Why can't we have a rational, testable environment where we expect the world to work well? And if it doesn't, we get people in trouble and we fix it. You know, how many people took a car here tonight? I didn't. I actually walked from across the street. The last time you got in a car that didn't have a seatbelt was when? It's not like the auto industry wanted to put seatbelts in. Now the reason why there are seatbelts is because of policy, journalism, scientists, advocates, laws, but that's the number one reason why people buy cars, is for safety. That's the number one feature they look for. So I actually feel like if we can get this right and not lose our stuff right now, we can actually build a culture where fact-based is actually the reason why you would go to an information source. Being able to understand the clues that you're talking about and having the direct relationship with the journalists who do that work, who you're surrounded by them here. I'm speechifying now, forgive me.
It's means to give you a tub to thumb.
No, just beer time, I think.
Well, we're going to draw this bit of the evening to a close and then allow you to continue vigorously debating. I bet you're surrounded by wine. So, can you join me in thanking the panel for their